The baby followed a German shepherd into the woods. What they found changed lives forever. It started with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that screams something is terribly wrong. And then, one tiny act of courage shattered that silence. What this little girl discovered behind an abandoned wall shocked her family, her town, and eventually the entire nation. Get ready. This is not just a story, it's a heartbeat. That morning felt different. The kind of different you don't see, you feel it. The trees stood unusually still, as if they were listening to something far away. The wind was quiet, unnaturally so, and even the birds, who usually chirped like they owned the sky, had gone silent. Something, somewhere, was holding its breath. Evelyn, Clara's grandmother, had lived in that house near the woods for over 40 years. She knew the sounds of that forest like she knew the rhythm of her own heartbeat. But that morning, when she stepped out onto the porch with her cup of tea, she felt something settle over her chest, tight and uneasy. Clara, her 2-year-old granddaughter, had been playing just a few feet away in the yard with her ever-watchful companion, Ranger, the family's aging but sharp-eyed German shepherd. The kind of dog who never let Clara out of his sight, even when she simply turned her head too fast. He was her shadow, her guardian, her silent friend. But now, there was no Clara. And no Ranger. Evelyn blinked, her heart skipping. She called out once, twice, then louder. No answer. She stepped out into the yard, barefoot, ignoring the cold grass beneath her feet. The toy Clara had been playing with still lay on the ground, half buried in soil. Evelyn's chest tightened further. Then she heard it. A bark. Distant. Chirp. From deep inside the woods. It echoed once, then again, closer to a howl than a call. Evelyn froze. Ranger never left the yard. Not unless something was wrong. She dropped the mug. It shattered on the steps, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes were fixed on the tree line. There was movement, small, swift, but no figure. The forest, once familiar, now looked like a stranger. The path leading into it seemed darker than it ever had. Another bark. Then silence. "Clara!" Evelyn called, her voice shaking now, raw with fear. No answer. Not even a rustle. She ran inside, called for help. The forest, meanwhile, just stood there, still, watchful, as if it had secrets it wasn't ready to give up. What Evelyn didn't know was that Clara hadn't wandered off by accident. She had followed something, or someone, and Ranger, faithful as ever, had followed her into a part of the forest no one had stepped into for years. Something was waiting there, something buried in roots and silence. And as Evelyn stood helpless at the edge of the trees, she felt it in her bones. The forest was alive. And it had just taken her baby. Long before the forest held its breath, before the trees whispered secrets Clara would one day stumble upon, there was just a girl, a dog, and a quiet connection no one truly understood. Clara had only just turned 2, still in the stage where her words came out half-formed and wrapped in giggles. But even without full sentences, she spoke volumes. And Ranger understood every syllable, every shrug, every look. He wasn't just any dog. Ranger had once been a trained PTSD service companion, assigned to a veteran who later passed away. When the shelter listed him as calm, observant, unnaturally intelligent, Evelyn's daughter had thought he'd be perfect for a household with a toddler. No one realized just how perfect he would be. The first time Clara touched Ranger's fur, she didn't laugh or squeal. She simply placed her tiny hand on his back and leaned her head against his ribs, like greeting an old friend. Ranger didn't flinch, didn't move. He just blinked, once, and let out a breath as though something deep inside him had finally relaxed. From that day forward, they were inseparable. Ranger followed her with a quiet dignity. He never barked at passing cars, never growled at guests, never chased squirrels like other dogs. But the moment Clara so much as frowned, his ears perked. When she giggled, his tail wagged once, just once, like a proud confirmation. He'd lay his head on her lap while she babbled nonsense, and his eyes stayed on her every movement, as though he was listening not just to her sounds, but to her silences. Evelyn, watching from the porch rocker, would often smile and whisper to herself, "They speak a language no one else understands." She wasn't wrong. One autumn afternoon, Clara had been sitting near the tree stump in the back, idly flipping through the pages of a picture book, upside down. Ranger was curled beside her, chin resting on her foot. Out of nowhere, Clara suddenly began to cry. Not a tantrum, not hunger, not boredom, just quiet, heartbreaking tears. Before Evelyn could step off the porch, Ranger was already up, nudging Clara's face with his snout. When she wouldn't look up, he darted into the house and returned seconds later, holding Clara's favorite blanket in his mouth. Evelyn hadn't even realized it was missing from the crib. Moments like that became common. When Clara wouldn't sleep, Ranger stood watch by her crib all night. When she laughed, he'd nuzzle her side. When she wandered too close to the shed, he'd gently block her path. There was an intelligence in his eyes, deep, aged, almost human. One evening, Evelyn shared a memory with her neighbor, Martha. "You know," she said, stirring sugar into her tea, "Clara didn't start talking until after she met Ranger." Martha chuckled. "That dog probably taught her how." Evelyn paused. Maybe. Or maybe he was the only one listening before the rest of us could understand her. In those early months, Clara's mother, busy with work and life, sometimes missed the subtle emotional cues Clara gave off. But not Ranger. Never Ranger. He was more than just a watchdog. He was a mirror, a translator, a guardian. Once, during a stormy night, the power had gone out. Thunder cracked the sky like an open wound. Clara was scared, everyone was, but instead of crying, she crawled across the floor, grabbed Ranger's ear gently, and held it like a child clutches a favorite toy. He didn't move, just sat there, tall and unshaken, until the lights returned and Clara fell asleep right beside him. It wasn't just comfort. It was trust, the kind that doesn't need to be taught. The kind we're either born with or earned through something older than memory. And Ranger had earned it. There were moments that made Evelyn wonder if Clara remembered something the rest of them didn't. Like the time she placed a flower on Ranger's food bowl, whispered something soft, and walked away. Or when she led him to the back of the shed and pointed to a patch of untouched soil. Just stood there, looking, not moving. Ranger had growled that day. Not in anger. In warning. It unsettled Evelyn, though she said nothing. Because part of her understood, even if she didn't know why. Sometimes, when the light caught just right through the kitchen window, Evelyn would look outside and see Clara talking to Ranger. Not playing, not laughing, just talking, soft, serious, like she was telling him a secret. And Ranger? He always listened. Ears tilted, eyes wide, breathing steady. No judgment, no questions. Just the kind of presence we all wish we had when the world feels too big for our little hands. Evelyn often believed that perhaps the bond between child and dog wasn't built in those early months, but remembered from some distant place. Like they'd known each other before the world began again. She never said it out loud. People wouldn't understand. But deep down, she knew Ranger and Clara weren't just connected by love. They were connected by purpose. And purpose has a way of pulling us, quietly, firmly, toward something waiting to be discovered. That morning, the woods didn't feel the same. There was no breeze, no birdsong, no sound at all. Just a strange stillness, as though the forest had stopped breathing. The leaves didn't rustle. The trees stood frozen, tall and unmoving, like silent witnesses holding in a secret. Even the light that usually filtered through the canopy above seemed hesitant, dull, gray, heavy. The air was thick with a quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt alert. Ranger stood at the edge of the backyard, his ears forward, his body tense. He wasn't sniffing the ground like he normally did or chasing the shadows of passing squirrels. He was still, waiting, sensing. Something had pulled him to the edge of the trees, something not loud or violent, but deep and unfamiliar. And beside him, clutching the loose skin of his neck with her tiny fingers, was Clara. She didn't say a word. At 2 years old, Clara barely spoke anyway. But she didn't need to. Not with Ranger. They had always understood each other in silence. She simply looked at him, those round eyes full of curiosity and trust, and when Ranger stepped into the woods, she followed without hesitation, as if her feet already knew the way. They walked past the last patch of sunlight, stepping onto a trail that had long disappeared under moss and fallen leaves. The backyard, the swing set, the safety of home, they all faded behind them. Ahead, the forest was thick and deep. The trees grew closer together, their limbs crooked like old fingers pointing in every direction. Ranger moved with purpose, his body close to the ground, every breath measured, every sound noted. His instincts were awake in a way they hadn't been in years. Clara, barefoot and stumbling slightly on uneven roots, didn't seem afraid. She moved like she belonged there, like the forest wasn't a stranger at all. Her little laugh echoed once, soft and delicate, as she bent down to pick something out of the dirt. It was a shoe. Not hers. A child's shoe, small, pink, and faded. It was covered in mud, one lace frayed and nearly torn off. Clara held it up with wonder, as if she'd found treasure. But Ranger froze. He sniffed it. The scent was faint, very old, but undeniably human. And young. There was no reason that shoe should have been there. No trail, no sign of campers or hikers, and certainly no recent visitors. Ranger growled under his breath, low and uneasy, but Clara had already turned her attention elsewhere. She toddled off the path, if it could even be called that, and found something else beneath a half-rotted log. The toy. A doll's head. Just the head. Its eyes were open, one of them missing, and its plastic surface was scratched and clouded with time. Hair matted. Lips frozen in a permanent smile. Clara poked it gently, curious, still not frightened. But Ranger felt his fur rise along his spine. The air had shifted. It was colder now. He looked up. The trees looked different. They hadn't moved, he was sure of that, but they felt closer, tighter, as if the forest had narrowed behind them, boxing them in, as if it had noticed their presence and decided not to let them leave. Ranger positioned himself between Clara and the shadows. His paws dug into the earth. Every muscle in his body was awake. He didn't understand what they had walked into, but whatever it wasn't just old. It was waiting. And Clara, she just kept walking. She climbed a small hill without struggle, brushing her hand along the moss-covered bark of a nearby tree. Then she stopped. Ranger reached her side, and when he looked where she was pointing, his body locked. There, almost hidden by ivy and roots, stood the outline of a cabin. It shouldn't have been there. The wood was worn down to splinters. The windows were clouded with grime. A single shutter dangled off its hinge, creaking slightly though there was no wind. The front door was crooked, closed, but not tightly. Nature had claimed most of it. Vines covered half the roof. Ferns had grown through the porch. No visible path led to it. No reason for it to be in the middle of these woods. But it was. Clara stared at it, wide-eyed, her lips parted like she was remembering something she hadn't lived through. She took a step forward. Ranger moved instantly, blocking her with his body. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just stood there, silently refusing to let her go farther. Clara didn't fight. She placed her hand on his back and leaned her weight into him, and for a long moment, they both just stood there, child and dog, facing something forgotten. Ranger's heart pounded in his chest. His ears twitched at sounds only he could hear, faint shifting behind the trees, a snap of twig too far off to trace, a sound like breath, but too still to be human. He didn't know what this place was. But he knew one thing. They hadn't stumbled upon it. They had been led. And something old, quiet, and patient had been waiting. The cabin stood like a memory that time had tried to erase but failed. Hidden beneath a veil of moss and twisted vines, its rotting frame leaned slightly to one side, as if it had been holding its breath for too many years. The wood was gray with age, weathered and cracked, almost blending with the forest itself. Even in stillness, it gave off a strange hum, like the kind you feel more than hear. A kind of recognition, or warning. Clara didn't hesitate. She took one step forward, her tiny foot crunching over a layer of dry leaves and forgotten time, and Ranger, after a tense pause, followed. He didn't like it, not the way the shadows hugged the corners of the structure, not the scent of damp wood mixed with something stale and distant, but Clara's presence grounded him. He couldn't let her go alone. The steps to the porch creaked beneath their weight, though they were featherlight. The door, aged and swollen with years of rain, didn't resist. It opened with a long, low groan like an old man waking from a dream. Inside, the air was thick with dust, heavy with silence, and somehow strangely warm. Clara stepped in first. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. Her little eyes wandered across the space like she was seeing something familiar, not from this life, perhaps, but from somewhere deeper. She walked slowly, carefully, her head tilting from side to side like she was following an invisible thread. And then she smiled. Ranger watched her carefully, ears twitching at every creak of the floorboards. The cabin had only one room. It was small and sunken in places, the ceiling sagging above them like it too had grown tired of standing. Dust hung in the air like tiny ghosts, dancing in beams of pale, broken sunlight coming through cracked glass. On the far wall, faded children's drawings were still clinging to the wood, sunshine, a stick figure family, a dog with long ears, and a little girl with yellow scribbles for hair. The crayon colors had dulled with age, but the shapes still held life. As Clara stood in front of them, she raised her hand slowly and pressed her palm to one of the drawings. The flower, maybe, or a star. Behind her, Ranger sniffed at a corner where dried flowers had been placed in a cracked glass jar. They were brittle now, brown, forgotten, but arranged carefully, as if someone had once knelt there with reverence. As if they meant something. A small wooden cradle sat crooked beneath the window. Its rocking legs were broken on one side, and inside lay a piece of frayed fabric, once a blanket, now little more than threads. Ranger stepped closer, nose twitching. It smelled like dust and old sorrow. No recent scent. No animal intrusion. Just silence. Clara moved without instruction. She walked to the far wall and touched a small shelf where a porcelain bird sat, one wing chipped off. Then she turned around slowly and looked at the room, really looked, her face calm, serious. Not like a child discovering something new, but like someone who had returned to something that once belonged to them. Ranger stood beside her, his body close, protective. His instincts were still alert, but something in Clara's demeanor made him pause. It was as if she wasn't afraid because she somehow understood this place, even though she'd never been there before. She sat down quietly on the floor, legs crossed, staring at the cradle. Her fingers traced circles in the dust. And for a moment, the forest outside seemed to hold still. No creaks, no breeze, no birdsong. Just the faint echo of something lost. Ranger sat beside her, never taking his eyes off the door. He could feel something just beyond the edge of hearing. A tension, a memory. Not his, but the house's. The scent of human sadness, old and cold, clung to the walls like mold. And still, Clara remained calm. She reached for the blanket inside the cradle, lifted it gently, and folded it across her lap as if she knew how. Then she leaned her head against Ranger's shoulder and sighed, not with fear or confusion, but something quieter, something heavier. Outside, a branch cracked. Ranger stood instantly, ears forward, body tight. But Clara didn't move. She simply whispered a single sound. Not a word, not something he recognized. Just a sound. So familiar. And when she said it, Ranger felt something shift, not outside, but inside. As if a memory buried in someone else's life had stirred. They stayed like that for minutes. Maybe more. No one came. The woods made no sound. Eventually, Clara stood. She walked to the door again, the blanket still in her hands. And as they stepped back out into the afternoon light, the forest seemed to breathe again. But the air behind them had changed. The path they'd come from was no longer there. The forest had always been there, just beyond the backyard, silent, old, unmoved. But the day Clara disappeared into it with Ranger, it felt closer somehow. Darker. As if it had inched forward when no one was looking. Evelyn stood on the porch longer than she realized, staring into the trees as though expecting them to answer her. And somewhere in the back of her mind, something stirred. A story. Not a memory of her own, exactly, but one she'd once been told in a quiet voice, over a late-night cup of tea, when the children had gone to bed and the air had just the right kind of chill to bring old stories out of hiding. It had happened in 1991. Evelyn remembered because she'd just started shelving books at the town library when the whispers began. A baby girl had vanished, just like that. One moment she'd been in her front yard playing with her mother nearby, and the next, there was nothing. No scream. No trail. Only her tiny sock found tangled in a patch of weeds near the edge of the woods, damp with morning dew. The town had searched for days. Police, neighbors, volunteers. Even dogs. But the forest had swallowed her whole. The case had quietly faded. Some called it a tragedy, others blamed it on a coyote or a drifter no one had seen. But there were always those few, the older ones, who spoke of the woods as something more. Not dangerous, not evil, but aware. As though it had its own memory. As though it remembered who walked among its trees and who didn't belong. Back in the woods, in the old decaying cabin, Ranger moved slowly, his nose close to the floor, his steps careful. Clara sat quietly nearby, cradling the faded blanket from the cradle in her lap, her tiny fingers rubbing its edges like she was trying to unlock something hidden inside it. The air was thick, the silence heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood beneath Ranger's paws. Something was calling to him, not with sound, but with something deeper. A pull. A scent half buried beneath layers of dust and time. He moved toward the far corner of the room, sniffing, pawing gently at the boards. Clara watched him without saying a word. She didn't need to. The floor gave a dull thump beneath Ranger's feet, different from the rest. Hollow. He scratched again, more firmly this time, sending dry splinters flying. The boards cracked. A small cavity appeared, and inside it, nestled in the dry earth, was an old, rusted tin box. Clara crawled over on her knees and sat beside it. The box was dented and cold, its hinges crusted with age. She reached out and opened it slowly, as if she already knew what was inside. The first thing she found was a photograph, faded and curled at the corners. A young woman stood in front of the same cabin, her arms wrapped protectively around a baby wrapped in a light pink blanket. The woman's face was thin, tired, but her eyes held something, fear, maybe, or defiance. And the baby, there was something about the baby's face that made Clara pause. She stared at it for a long time. Beneath the photo were torn pieces of paper. Journal pages, written in shaky handwriting. The ink had smudged with moisture, but a few words still bled through. "I can't go back. They wouldn't understand. The baby cries too loudly at night. I hear them outside." There was no name, no date. Just fragments of someone's desperate thoughts, locked away and forgotten. At the bottom of the tin box was a piece of folded paper, a hand-drawn map. It wasn't exact, just markings sketched in pencil. But Clara traced the lines with her finger, stopping at the tiny X near the center. This was it. This was where they were. The same place where that young woman had once stood holding her baby, the same place Evelyn had long forgotten hearing about. The same woods. Outside the cabin, a branch snapped. Not the soft crack of a falling twig, but a deliberate sound. Sharp, close, like someone stepping where they shouldn't. Ranger tensed, his eyes fixed on the door, his body between Clara and the opening. But no one came in. No one spoke. Just the trees breathing again, louder than before. Far away, Evelyn paced in the yard, her hand pressed to her chest. She didn't know what Clara and Ranger had found. She didn't know about the photo or the journal or the map. But something inside her, something old and unexplainable, told her that the woods were not silent today. She picked up her phone and called Martha, her friend who had lived on the edge of town all her life. Evelyn asked, without really knowing why, "Do you remember that baby who disappeared back in '91? Martha went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Some folks said the baby was taken. Others said the woods kept her." Evelyn looked again at the tree line. The wind had picked up now. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe the woods were just awake. "She's not the first," Evelyn whispered. And as she did, she realized with a chill that the story she once dismissed as myth may have been more truth than anyone had dared to admit. The journal pages smelled of damp paper and silence. They were brittle at the edges, stained in places where time had left its mark. The ink faded like a whisper barely clinging to the surface. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, holding the torn sheets in her lap with a quietness that didn't seem to match her age. Her fingers moved gently across the handwriting, slow and curious, as if she already knew these words before she could read them. Ranger sat beside her, his body still, eyes alert. The cabin around them groaned softly in the wind, the trees outside brushing against the walls like old memories trying to get in. The journal had been buried in the tin box, under the photograph and map, forgotten by the world. But not by the woods. And not by Clara. The handwriting was uneven. Some lines slanted down the page, others squeezed into corners like they'd been written in the dark. And though many words had washed away over time, some remained, stubborn and clear. "My name is Sarah." That was how it began. No last name, no date, just a name and a story too heavy to keep inside. Sarah wrote of fear first. It clung to every line. Not the kind of fear that comes from fairy tales or shadows in the woods, but the kind that lives behind closed doors. The kind that comes with knowing the person you once trusted most could now hurt you when no one's looking. She had run, that much was clear. Left in the night with nothing but a baby in her arms and a bag full of old food, broken dreams, and one last ounce of hope. She had stumbled through these woods in the dark, with bare feet and a bleeding lip, guided only by the sound of her child breathing. The cabin wasn't a shelter when she found it. It was a ruin. But it had 4 walls, a roof that mostly held, and enough distance from the town that no one would think to look there. So she stayed. Clara tilted the page slowly, squinting at one passage where the words were more legible than the rest. "She doesn't cry much anymore. Only at night, when it's cold. I think she knows I'm trying." Another line, this one shakier. "There are nights I want to give up, but then I look at her and I can't. She deserves more than fear. Clara looked up for a moment, toward the cradle in the corner. The blanket she'd carried earlier was folded neatly beside it now, as if placed there on instinct. She stood and walked toward the wall beside the drawings she had admired earlier. There, tucked behind a loose board, she found more scraps, small ones, folded and pressed into the space like offerings. She brought them back to the floor, and Ranger watched her carefully, his head resting on his paws. One page showed a hurried sketch, a crude drawing of a woman holding a child beneath a starry sky. Another showed what looked like a forest trail, winding around a tall tree with a strange mark on it. And another, a simple, smiling face. Round cheeks, wide eyes, short curly hair. A child's face, drawn again and again in different poses. In every version, the child looked happy. But to Clara, it wasn't a stranger's face. It looked like hers. Same cheeks, same curls, even the tiny mark just beneath the eye. She reached up and touched the spot on her own skin as though confirming what she already knew. She didn't seem surprised, only quiet. Evelyn would have told you that children carry pieces of the past without even knowing, that sometimes the soul remembers more than the body does. And in that moment, if anyone had seen Clara sitting there, still, focused, staring at a decades-old drawing of a child who had vanished into time, they might have wondered if some part of her had lived this story before. The journal went on. Sarah wrote of hunger, of cold, of trying to stretch canned soup and powdered milk across days and weeks. She wrote about singing lullabies through chattering teeth and rocking the baby in that same broken cradle until the wind outside began to sound like waves. She wrote about loneliness, not just being alone, but being unseen, as if the world had erased her the moment she left it behind. And yet, there was love. In every line. Fierce, burning, protective love. They'll say I was selfish for leaving. But no one saw the bruises. No one heard the words he said when the door was closed. I didn't run to disappear. I ran to survive. For her. Clara closed the journal softly and placed it on the ground like something sacred. She leaned against Ranger again, and he shifted just enough to let her rest comfortably, his eyes never leaving the open door. Outside, the wind carried the faintest sound, like laughter or a baby's cry. It faded as quickly as it came. But inside the cabin, something had settled. Not peace, exactly, but clarity. Whatever had happened in this place, whatever had been left behind, Clara had found it, not by accident, but by connection. The woods had remembered. The cabin had remembered. And maybe in her own silent way, Clara had too. She picked up one final page. The last one. It was only half a sentence. If anyone finds this, know that I... It stopped there. The ink trailed off, interrupted by time or tears or something worse. But the meaning lingered. Sarah had tried to leave something behind, a piece of her truth, buried where no one would find it, unless they were meant to. And now, years later, it was a 2-year-old girl who had uncovered it. The woods outside groaned softly. The trees leaned just a little. And deep inside the forest, the past echoed back, not in words, but in the hush of wind, the rustle of leaves, the slow creak of wood remembering everything it had witnessed. The sun had started to drop behind the trees when Evelyn finally picked up the phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed, breath short and shallow. She had waited too long, hoping Clara and Ranger would come trotting back through the yard the way they always did. But this time felt different. It had felt different from the moment she stepped outside and noticed the stillness. And now, hours later, with shadows stretching long across the grass and not a single sound from the forest, she knew she could wait no more. By the time the first patrol car arrived, a soft dusk had settled in. Evelyn's voice cracked as she spoke to the officer. She's 2. Her name is Clara. And she's with the dog, Ranger. They were just here this morning, I only turned my back for a minute. The officer, a young man with tired eyes and a notepad in hand, nodded with practiced calm. You said they've wandered into the woods before? Evelyn shook her head. Never this far. Never out of sight. Within an hour, more lights appeared along the gravel road. Neighbors with flashlights, volunteers with reflective vests, deputies unloading search equipment from their trunks. A drone was launched and tracking dogs brought in. The small clearing outside the house became a hive of movement and worried whispers. But the forest still loomed in silence, as if watching the scene unfold from just beyond the trees. They began sweeping the forest in teams, calling Clara's name, clapping, whistling, trying to draw her or Ranger out with sound. But the deeper they went, the less sound seemed to carry. Radios crackled. GPS trackers slowed. At one point, a deputy frowned at his screen and tapped it twice. Her dog's collar has a GPS, Evelyn said, suddenly hopeful. My daughter installed it a few months ago after he wandered into the neighbor's field. The deputy nodded. What's the app called? They pulled it up on Evelyn's phone. A little icon marked Ranger blinked red on the screen. The last ping had come from an area 2 miles into the woods. A place the tracker labeled, simply, as Zone 43 null. Dead zone, the deputy muttered. No signal out there. Evelyn stared at the dot. Can we get there? The deputy hesitated. We can try. They moved quickly now, forming new teams to search toward the last known location. Flashlights cut through the undergrowth. Dogs barked at nothing. Leaves rustled above, but no wind touched the faces of the searchers. And all the while, the deeper they went, the more uneasy the air became. A tall man in a ranger's jacket joined one of the teams. He'd lived in the area longer than most and knew these woods better than anyone. His name was Howard, though folks just called him Old Howie. He moved with purpose, but his face was drawn, thoughtful. As they passed a crooked elm marked with yellow paint, he stopped and stared ahead. This part of the forest, he said quietly, doesn't show up on our newer maps. One of the officers raised a brow. What do you mean? Howie squinted into the trees. There used to be a hunting cabin out here. Back in the late 80s, early 90s. Fell into disrepair. Some folks squatted in it for a while. Then the fire took it, burned most of it down. Forest Department ordered it demolished a year or two later. The officer frowned. You're saying there's a cabin here? There was a cabin, Howie said, his voice low. But it shouldn't be here anymore. Evelyn, walking just behind them, felt her breath catch. What did it look like? Howie looked back at her. Why? Because Clara might be in it. He stared at her for a moment, then turned back to the trees. If it's still standing, someone rebuilt it. But I swear to you, ma'am, it was torn down. I saw the demolition report myself. The team pressed forward. GPS readings flickered, then vanished entirely. Radios buzzed with static. Still no sign of Ranger. No sound of a child's voice. Just that overwhelming hush, the kind that presses into your skin like the weight of a storm before the rain ever comes. More volunteers joined the search. Flashlights moved like fireflies between the trunks. But the forest had a way of making people feel lost even when they weren't. Trees looked the same. Paths vanished behind you. Sound didn't travel the way it should. Evelyn stayed near the front, her face pale, her steps slow but steady. And then, without warning, the team in front came to a stop. A clearing opened before them. Small, overgrown, framed by thick underbrush and leaning trees. In the center stood a structure. Old, leaning, covered in vines. But standing. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. That's it, she whispered. That's the place from the drawings, from the journal. The officers approached cautiously, flashlights sweeping over the walls. Wood splintered and blackened in places. The roof sagged slightly. It looked like it had fought hard not to fall apart, and almost lost. But it was still there, like a ghost that refused to disappear. They called Clara's name again. No response. Howie stood at the edge of the clearing and shook his head slowly. This shouldn't exist. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice shaky. But it does. And somewhere deep inside, though she couldn't yet explain why, she understood that this cabin wasn't just a place where someone had once lived. It was a place that had remembered, a place that had waited. And now, after all these years, it had opened its door again, for a little girl and her faithful dog. The forest didn't give warnings. It simply changed. One moment, the air was heavy and still, and the next, it was sharp with tension, like a violin string pulled tight. Clara sat by the hearth inside the old cabin, her fingers tracing circles into the dust. Ranger stood at the door, motionless, his ears high, tail low, body rigid. Something had changed outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees creaking or the way light flickered strangely through the leaves. It was something more ancient, more primal. The forest had gone quiet again. Ranger stepped out onto the cabin's porch, his body low, nose working overtime. His breath came in short, soundless bursts. He had been still like this once before, in another life, in another place, long before Clara, long before these woods. And just like then, he didn't need to see the threat to know it was there. Behind him, Clara giggled softly. She was still playing with a small wooden block she'd found beneath the old bed frame, unaware of the shift in the world around her. But Ranger's eyes never left the tree line. His paw stepped forward. Then another. Slow, deliberate. And then, all at once, the silence broke. A shadow lunged from the brush, low to the ground, snarling. It was a wild dog, or something close to one. Mangy, with patches of fur missing and eyes too sunken, too wild. Its ribs were visible, its breath ragged. It had likely wandered far from any known path, drawn by the unfamiliar scent of a child. It had been watching, waiting, and now it charged. Ranger didn't hesitate. He launched forward, his body moving with the kind of speed and precision only a trained protector knew. They collided hard, fur against fur, teeth flashing, growls tearing through the trees. Ranger barked once, loud and guttural, not in fear but in command. Clara shrieked inside the cabin and ducked beneath the old table, but Ranger couldn't look back. The fight was fast and brutal. Ranger had the size advantage, but the wild dog was desperate, fueled by hunger and madness. They tumbled into the underbrush, snapping branches and kicking up soil. Blood hit the air. A sharp yelp echoed through the woods. But Ranger held his ground. He bit hard into the creature's shoulder and forced it back, growling, his body now trembling with adrenaline and pain. The predator backed away, limping, snarling, but not daring to charge again. It stared at Ranger for a breath longer, then turned and melted back into the forest. Ranger didn't chase. He stood there, panting, his side bleeding, chest rising and falling with each deep breath. He had felt this before, the rush, the fire in his limbs, the noise inside his head. But it wasn't just instinct. It was something else. Memory. Before Clara, before the cabin, before the quiet life of backyards and nap times, Ranger had served. He had worn a vest that said, "Service Animal, PTSD Support." He had trained for months to do one thing, protect. Not just physically, but emotionally. To sense pain. To step in when a human couldn't step out. His first companion had been a veteran named Marcus, a man whose nights were haunted by sounds no one else could hear. Ranger had learned to recognize tension in breath, tremor in hands, silence that meant danger. He had been more than a pet. He had been a lifeline. There were nights when Marcus had cried into Ranger's fur like a child. Nights when a simple nudge from a cold nose had kept a man from slipping too far away. When Marcus passed, quietly in his sleep, Ranger had been by his side, loyal to the end. After that, he had been adopted by Evelyn's daughter and eventually found his way into Clara's life. But that instinct, that training, that purpose had never left him. Some part of him had simply waited for the moment it would be needed again. And now it had been. He limped back toward the cabin, his paw dragging slightly. Clara came running out the door, her eyes wide with concern. She didn't cry. She simply wrapped her arms around his leg and buried her face in his fur. He licked her head softly, his breath still shaking. The wound on his side was deep, but not fatal. Evelyn would panic when she saw it, he knew. But that didn't matter now. All that mattered was Clara, alive, unhurt, still humming her little tune as if nothing had happened. As the sun began to set fully behind the treetops, the forest eased again. The tension lifted just slightly. Ranger sat down beside Clara, his body tired but alert. He wouldn't sleep. Not yet. He had seen too much to believe the worst was over. Inside the cabin, the air felt warmer somehow, like the walls had acknowledged his role. The place that had once sheltered a desperate mother and her child now held another pair, different, but the same in all the ways that mattered. And for Ranger, bleeding but alive, this was more than instinct. It was more than training. This was duty. The kind you carry in your bones, even when no one else remembers who you used to be. The forest had started to shift again, but this time, not with threat, with movement. Voices in the distance. Flashlights bobbing between trees. The first light reached the clearing just as the sun dropped below the horizon, and the beam fell squarely on the cabin. It wasn't a cabin anymore, not really. From where the search team stood, it looked more like a ruin held together by memory than wood. But it stood, and inside, sitting quietly by the hearth with a dog curled around her feet, was Clara. She didn't cry when they opened the door. She just looked up with wide, solemn eyes and calmly held out the journal in her hand, as if she had been expecting someone to come and take it. Ranger's ears twitched, but he didn't rise. His eyes stayed locked on the doorway until Evelyn appeared. Evelyn didn't rush. She didn't shout. Her voice cracked softly as she stepped forward. "Clara, baby." Clara stood up and walked slowly into her grandmother's arms. There were no tears, just the tight, clinging grip of a child who had traveled through something vast and wordless. Evelyn pressed her lips to the top of her granddaughter's head, breathing in her scent like it would bring her back to the present. Behind them, one of the deputies stepped carefully across the sagging floorboards. His flashlight caught on something, not movement, not wood. Just something different. A hollow sound as his boot shifted a loose plank. He knelt down and peeled it back. Beneath the cabin floor, the earth had sunk slightly, damp from decades of water and decay. But as his light passed over the dirt, it caught on something pale. Too pale. He called for backup quietly, his voice tightening. It didn't take long. What they uncovered wasn't whole. Time had taken too much. But it was unmistakable. Small bones, a fragile skull, tattered remnants of a pink blanket, now barely clinging to color. The team stood silent. Even the birds had gone quiet again. One of the forensic techs whispered something that no one wanted to say out loud. "This is old. Decades at least." Evelyn held Clara closer, her face unreadable. And yet, Clara didn't turn away. She looked directly at the space beneath the floor, where the small remains rested. There was no fear in her eyes. No confusion. Only a sad sort of knowing. Ranger stayed beside them, his breathing slow, his wound drying into a stiff patch of fur along his side. The lights buzzed, the radios crackled. But none of it seemed to touch Clara. She was watching something no one else could see. Then, as if pulled by something inside her, she stepped forward. She knelt at the edge of the cabin, still holding the journal in her hand. And gently, she laid it down beside the hollow in the floor, like a gift being returned to its rightful place. Her tiny hands smoothed the pages, and when she looked back at Evelyn, her eyes held something no 2-year-old's eyes should. A kind of memory. Evelyn knelt beside her and touched the cover of the journal. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "Where did you find this?" Clara didn't answer, not in words. She simply looked at the drawings on the wall. The ones that hadn't faded away. The smiling girl. The flower. The bird. Then, finally, the drawing of the cabin itself. The resemblance was undeniable. Evelyn followed her gaze, her chest tightening. The child in the drawing, the round cheeks, the soft curls, it was Clara. Or someone who could have been Clara. But the drawing had been made long before Clara had even been born. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she reached down and touched the small wooden block Clara had been playing with earlier. It had been carved, not molded, handmade. The letters on its side were faded, but visible. That name again. That girl again. Sarah's child. One of the rangers. Came over and cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, this cabin, it isn't supposed to exist. We tore this down. I saw the permit myself. Burned in a storm years ago. There's no record of it still standing." Evelyn looked at him, her voice quiet. "Then maybe it's standing for a reason." The man didn't reply. Outside, the wind picked up just slightly. The trees rustled, but now it sounded different. Not like warning. Not like threat. Like release. The remains were carefully covered. Photographs were taken. The journal was placed into a forensic evidence bag, but Evelyn knew, somehow, that its story had already been told. Clara stood beside Ranger, holding his ear like she always did when she needed comfort. And he, despite the pain in his side, sat tall and still. One of the officers tried to coax Clara toward the van, offering juice and a warm blanket. But Clara reached up and tugged gently on Evelyn's sweater instead. She wanted to go home. And Evelyn knew, this child, her granddaughter, had walked through something far beyond anything they could explain. Some mysteries stay buried forever, but some, for reasons no one can name, find their way back. It began in whispers. Not in the woods. Not in the shadows. But back home, in the quiet safety of Clara's bedroom, where soft toys lined the shelves and sunlight poured gently through the curtains. You'd think that after all she'd been through, Clara would need rest, long sleep, perhaps weeks of gentle healing. But no, that little girl, she didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She simply changed. Evelyn noticed it first the morning after the search party brought her home. Clara sat on her bed, hugging a stuffed bear, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Evelyn, thinking the child might be in shock, sat down beside her, brushing her hand across her hair, just as she had done since the day she was born. And then, without looking up, Clara spoke. "The crying draws them in," she said quietly. "I have to stay quiet." Evelyn's heart stopped. Not just because Clara was speaking in full sentences, something she'd rarely done before, but because those weren't just words. They were Sarah's words. Evelyn had read them, or something nearly identical, scratched into the brittle pages of that old journal pulled from beneath the floorboards of a cabin that wasn't supposed to exist. Clara shouldn't have known those words. But she said them as if they belonged to her. Evelyn tried to ask questions gently, but Clara had already gone quiet again. She turned her face toward the window, calm as ever, and said no more. But later that day, as Evelyn folded laundry in the living room, she heard Clara's voice again from the hallway. "They said I was selfish, but they didn't see the bruises." This time Evelyn dropped the towel in her hands. She turned to look at her granddaughter, standing there with her hand on the doorframe, speaking in a tone too calm for a child, too rehearsed, like memories spoken aloud. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table long after the house went still, the ticking of the clock growing louder than the wind outside. Her tea had gone cold, untouched in its mug. She stared at the photo on the fridge, Clara's smile, those same eyes. But now they looked back at her with something deeper than innocence. Something older. Ranger lay by the back door, not sleeping either. His eyes remained open, ears gently twitching at the slightest sound. As if he too was waiting. The next day, Evelyn made an appointment. She brought Clara to a quiet office on the edge of town. The walls were painted pale green, there were soft chairs, warm lighting, and a therapist with kind eyes who listened more than she spoke. Evelyn explained everything. The forest, the journal, the things Clara had said. And when she finished, the therapist leaned back in her chair and asked a question that didn't sound like one. "Do you believe trauma can echo?" Evelyn blinked. "You mean, like trauma passed down? In the body?" "No," the woman said softly. "I mean in the soul. In stories. In places. Can a child carry something unfinished from someone they've never met?" Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. Clara was building a little tower from colored blocks in the corner of the room, her fingers moving slowly, carefully. She placed one final block on top. Then, without turning around, she spoke again. "I rocked her to sleep even when my arms were shaking." The therapist froze. So did Evelyn. "Who rocked who?" the therapist asked gently. Clara placed both hands on her knees and whispered, "Mama did." Her voice didn't quiver. It didn't question. She wasn't imagining. She was remembering. The therapist didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was low, almost reverent. "Let her talk," she said. "Let her remember. Don't force it. Don't label it. Just listen." That evening, Evelyn sat in her rocker with Clara curled in her arms. The house was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, not strong, just enough to stir the leaves. Ranger sat by the door, alert as always, his body still, his eyes soft but watchful. Evelyn looked down at Clara, gently brushing a curl from her cheek. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "who was the woman in the cabin? Do you remember her?" Clara didn't look up. She just nodded. "Did she talk to you?" "No," Clara said. "But I know her." "And how do you know the things she said?" Clara's small voice floated in the quiet room. "Because she didn't finish her story." Evelyn felt her throat close. She held Clara tighter and kissed the top of her head. Later that night, Evelyn woke with a start. The house was silent, but something felt different. She slipped quietly from her bed and walked down the hall. The door to Clara's room was open. The little girl was fast asleep, her hand resting on Ranger's side. And Ranger? He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the window. Outside, the trees stood still beneath a silver sky, and the stars seemed to blink slower than usual. Evelyn stood beside Ranger, placing a gentle hand on his head. "I believe you know," she whispered. "Don't you, boy?" He didn't move. He didn't need to. Somewhere beyond that window, or maybe somewhere inside this very house, the past was settling. Not gone. Not erased. But heard. And sometimes that's all a story needs. To be heard. The letter came 2 weeks later. A plain envelope, no return address, just the seal of the county coroner's office pressed neatly in one corner. Evelyn didn't open it right away. She stared at it for hours, left it on the windowsill, made tea, folded towels, watched Clara nap with Ranger beside her. All the little things that fill the day when your heart is afraid to know something you already suspect. When she finally opened it, the words were brief. Quiet. Just the facts. The remains found beneath the cabin had been tested. The DNA had been compared. The girl, the one buried quietly so many years ago, forgotten by the world but not by the woods, was not a stranger after all. She was family. Sarah had been Evelyn's niece, a sister to Evelyn's late brother, long estranged. Sarah had disappeared from records decades ago. No marriage certificate, no forwarding address. A note in a hospital logbook was the last anyone had seen of her. A visit after a fall, nothing more. After that, nothing. Now Evelyn knew why. Sarah had escaped. And in doing so, she had vanished. With her child. With her fear. With her story. And all these years later, it was Clara who had found her. Or maybe it was Sarah who had found Clara. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. She sat for a long time in the kitchen, hands still, staring out at the line where the forest met the field. That evening, she called her daughter. They sat together on the porch, two generations of women, speaking quietly as the stars began to gather overhead. Evelyn explained it all. The journal, the remains, the cabin that should not have been there, the drawings, the way Clara had spoken words she could not have known. Her daughter said nothing for a long time, just stared at the darkening tree line, her hand resting gently on Clara's head as the child dozed between them. "What do we do with this?" she finally whispered. "What do we tell her when she's older?" Evelyn didn't have an answer. Some truths are like stones in the pocket, not heavy enough to sink you, but always there, always reminding you of where you've been. "She'll tell us," Evelyn said softly, "when she's ready." And so, the family did not hold a funeral. They held something quieter. A walk. At dusk, they returned to the edge of the forest, not to the deep clearing, not to the hidden cabin no one could find again now that the wind had turned, but to the nearest place the light could still reach. They brought a small bouquet of dried wildflowers. Clara picked them herself. Evelyn brought a photograph from an old album she hadn't opened in decades. It showed her brother as a child, and Sarah beside him, both smiling, both unaware of what life would one day become. They stood in silence. No speeches, no prayers, just the wind moving gently through the grass and the sound of a bird somewhere above, calling out into the twilight. Clara laid the flowers down at the base of a tree. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Ranger sat beside her, steady and tall, his gaze fixed on the woods as if guarding the moment itself. Then, just before they turned to leave, Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a single wooden block, carved and faded, the letter L just barely visible. She placed it gently on the tree root. A name lost to time, now remembered. And then they walked home. That night, Evelyn tucked Clara into bed with more care than usual. She stayed beside her long after the child had closed her eyes, watching the rhythm of her breath, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. She thought of Sarah, young, terrified, strong in a way no one ever knew, and the child she had loved enough to hide, to shelter, even in the darkest corners of the world. She thought of how the forest had kept that story safe, and how, somehow, it had found its way home again. Not for headlines, not for justice, but for peace. Because sometimes, the truth we keep is not the one we speak aloud. It's the one we carry, softly, in the way we remember, in the way we hold silence like ceremony, in the way a little girl lays flowers for someone she never met, but somehow always knew. Time passed, but something in Clara never quite went back to what it had been. She still laughed. She still played. She still danced barefoot in the grass when the wind was just right. But her eyes had seen something, known something. And though she rarely spoke of the cabin or the journal or the drawings, the past now lived quietly within her, like an old tune she could hum, even if she didn't know the words. And always, Ranger was nearby. He followed her everywhere, though his steps had begun to slow. His breath came a little heavier on the warm days. The scar on his side, from the forest fight, had healed, but his body had grown tired. He still stood when she entered her room, still wagged his tail when she reached for his ear. But sometimes now he needed help getting back up again. Evelyn noticed first. The little things. Ranger lying down sooner than usual after walks. His food left untouched some mornings. That old sparkle in his eyes, still there, but dimmer, like a fading lantern at dusk. Clara never left his side. She sat beside him on the porch, her tiny hand resting on his fur as the summer days stretched into early fall. She spoke to him often, quiet words, half whispers, sometimes just soft hums that only he could understand. He listened as he always had. And then one morning the house was still. Ranger didn't rise to greet the day. He lay beneath the tree in the backyard, the one where he and Clara had first played chase, where he'd taught her to throw leaves into the wind, where he'd stood guard without fail each night since their return from the woods. Clara had found him there just before sunrise. He was awake, but barely. His breathing was slow, his eyes soft, like he knew something she didn't, or maybe something she already did. She didn't call for help. She didn't cry. She simply curled up beside him, resting her head on his chest, the way she had done so many times before. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, her hands trembling, unsure whether to intervene, but she knew. This was something sacred, something shared between a girl and her guardian, something no one else should interrupt. The sun rose slowly that morning. Clara stayed there, whispering into Ranger's ear. No one heard the words. No one needed to. She stayed with him until the end. And when it came gently. A soft breath out. A final twitch of his ear. And then stillness. Not the kind that haunts. The kind that rests. Later that afternoon, Evelyn, Clara, and her daughter stood together beneath that tree. They didn't dress in black. There were no flowers, no prayers. Just a small patch of earth made ready with care, and a wooden marker Clara had carved herself, with Evelyn's help. One single word etched carefully with small, deliberate hands. Ranger. Clara placed her favorite ribbon beside the marker, the blue one Ranger had once caught between his teeth and refused to give back, long ago in the kitchen. Evelyn smiled, remembering. The tree above them rustled softly. And then Clara, without being asked, stepped forward, knelt beside the fresh earth, and whispered so low it barely carried on the wind. "You saved me again." Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't spill. Because she knew. Ranger had not left her. He had simply done what he was always meant to do, stay by her side until he knew she was ready to walk without him. And somehow she was. That evening, Evelyn sat on the porch, watching Clara trace circles into the dirt with a stick, her curls blowing gently in the breeze. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in knowing. Ranger had been more than a dog. He had been a bridge between her and a story no one else could have reached. Now that chapter had closed. Not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Time kept moving, the way it always does, gently and without permission. The house felt quieter after Ranger was gone, but not empty. His absence didn't echo, it settled, like the last note of a beautiful song that still lingers in the room long after it fades. And in that silence, something else began to grow, Clara. She wasn't the same child who once wandered into the woods with Ranger by her side. She had changed. Not in the ways most people notice. She still had her soft curls and that little giggle that came when the wind played with the curtains, but in her eyes. They held something now. Something quiet and old and deeply human. Clara had seen something most children never see. Felt something they aren't meant to feel. But it didn't break her. It rooted her. She spoke less than before, but when she did, people listened, not because her voice was loud, but because it carried weight. Like she was remembering something more than just her own thoughts. and Scout was always beside her. He wasn't like Ranger. He was young, clumsy, with paws too big for his body. He'd trip over sticks and bark at shadows that turned out to be his own tail. But when it came to Clara, he was still, gentle, protective in a way that didn't come from training, but from something deeper, something almost inherited. Evelyn would often watch them from the porch. Clara, sitting under the same tree where Ranger had taken his last breath, Scout curled beside her like he knew this place mattered. Sometimes she would hum softly, not a song, but a rhythm, like she was remembering something no one had ever taught her. Evelyn had begun writing again. Not for others, just for herself. Late at night, she'd sit at the old wooden table with a pen in hand and a blanket around her shoulders, pouring the story into a little blue notebook. It wasn't a journal. It was a gift, a memory, a way to speak the things her voice couldn't always carry. She called it The Dog Who Remembered. It was the story of a dog who didn't just follow, but led. Who didn't just guard, but listened. Who didn't just protect one child, but carried the weight of a forgotten one too. It wasn't Ranger's story exactly, but it was. In every word, in every pause between sentences, in every breath Evelyn took between the lines. And sometimes, when Clara couldn't sleep, Evelyn would read to her. She never asked questions, never interrupted. She'd just curl up beside her grandmother, her head resting on Evelyn's chest, listening. As if the words were familiar, as if she'd heard them before in another life. One spring morning, Clara came in from the yard with mud on her feet and wonder in her eyes. "There's a puppy," she said, almost whispering. "He followed me home." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, but when she stepped outside, there he was. Small, shaggy, all ears and paws, sitting patiently at the steps like he already belonged. No tag, no chip, no one in town claimed him. So, Clara named him Scout. And just like that, life continued. The seasons rolled forward. Leaves turned and fell. The air shifted. And through it all, Clara grew. Into herself. Into her story. Into the kind of person who understood loss without bitterness, silence without discomfort, and love without needing words. A year after the woods, Evelyn finished her story. She wrote the final line with tears in her eyes and peace in her chest. He didn't just remember the past. He guarded the future. She closed the notebook and placed it beside a photograph on the shelf, one where Clara stood next to Ranger, both of them staring into the trees, like they knew the forest was holding something only they could see. And then, on a soft, quiet morning, the kind where the wind carries more than air, Clara stood at the edge of the woods again. Scout beside her. She looked back once. Just once. Evelyn stood on the porch, hand to her heart. Clara smiled. Not wide. Not loud. Just enough to say, "I remember." And then she turned and walked toward the trees. Not afraid. Not lost. Just ready. Because some stories don't end. They begin again. In footsteps that echo softly. In lives that carry love forward. In little girls with old souls, and dogs who remember. Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes, connections form in ways we don't understand. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible journeys. Until next time, stay curious and keep believing.